another story they never told you in VBS. I'm pretty sure they never told you this in VBS, at least probably not, kind of in the details that we're going to talk about today. So, our story so far. Think about this story like, and when you watch like the good Star Wars stuff, like Clone Wars and like, Bad Batch, things like that, and the narrator blasts in with like our story so far, and it's this because he catching up on the cliffhanger that was the previous episode. I was explaining to somebody the other day, like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were really into this, right? That kind of cliffhanger, short story movies that used to be all the thing, and kids would go hang out at the movie theaters, like when your grandparents were kids, and they'd watch these movies, or like on Saturday mornings. This is kind of like the thing that's going on. This is a cliffhanger coming out of chapter 4, going into chapter 5, because our story so far. Israel has suffered a heavy handed defeat thanks to the Philistines, and as a result, the Ark of the Covenant has been captured and uh, hauled back to Ashdod, because that's what you did. When you defeated another army and you could capture their gods, little g's, you would take them back as spoils and you'd put them in your temple, at the feet of your God, with the idea that then they would know that God would serve you. So that's what they do. Our story begins with the God of conquered Israel being placed in the temple of the victorious god Dagon. Uh, there's a lot can be said about this god Dagon. Like sometimes you see him referred to as like this god of like plant life and agriculture. Sometimes you just see him referred to as the fish god, like think of ancient Near Eastern Aquaman, and about as intriguing, I guess. Um, that's a lot of times you see him and he's kind of looks like a mermaid guy. It's kind of weird imagery, but anyway, so they put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple at the feet of their god Dagon. But then something really fishy happens. Dagon, this fish god guy, I can just picture the priests putting him in there, turning out the lights, closing the door, and going home for the night. Because it's like Taco Tuesday and they're in a hurry to get home. And then, like in the darkness, there, Dagon's just standing there minding his own business, kind of pondering on this, like Yahweh God who's in his house now. And he maybe hears this voice and he goes, I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me. And yeah, stuff happens. So, like when the priests show up the next morning, Dagon is laying prostrate, right, on the floor in front of the Ark of the Covenant, basically like paying obeisance to the God of Israel, who is supposed to be the conquered God. And I guess maybe so that like Yahweh won't hurt him. The priests of Dagon, these Philistines, are kind of weirded out by that. So, but they do what they do. They put him back up on his pedestal above the ark, and they go about their business. End of the day comes, turn off the lights, lock the door, go home, because Wednesday is pizza night, and but they're weirded out by it. Like they show up early the next morning because they want to make sure that everything's okay. And when they get there, what meets them is the statue of the god Dagon on the ground, right? But his head and his hands have been removed, right? He's been decapitated and dehanded. And his head and his hands are laying in the threshold of the doorway, right? And in the doorway, and just the body of the statue is just laying there on the floor. It's almost like I picture like him doing his best to try to escape, and like he's like crawling out and he just reaches the door, and God's like, get back here. So the God of defeated Israel has now killed their God effectively in his own house. So like, who is the conqueror? And then what proceeds next is just a great story, because the people of Ashdod now succumb to two things: tumors and then also mice. But it's the language about these tumors that's really interesting. Most translations will say tumors. So, like the NRSV will just say tumors. But then you have like the King James version that uses the word emerods, and then you have like the New American Bible, which just flat out says hemorrhoids. Um, so which I just love that idea that God is that kind of guy that he would take these really arrogant people who really think that they, like they have really conquered him and really conquered Israel and afflict them with one like such a personal thing, right? But not just like one or two people, not just the priests, like everybody in the city. Um, Now, granted, there's you got to talk about that word because what does it mean? Well, most, like I said, most of the translations are using the word tumors, right? Some of them use boil, the word boil, and that's because there's probably good evidence that maybe what they were being struck with was actually something, not that hemorrhoids aren't serious, but something much more serious like bubonic plague, especially when there's this reference to there were like tons and tons of mice. Because if you've studied your medieval history, you know the bubonic plague was carried by rats, specifically the fleas that were on the rats and on the mice. So there's a good chance that that's actually what it was. Um, but then you have sources from like the medieval Hebrew scholars and like pre-medieval Hebrew scholars who are talking about this, and they're using language that leads one to suspect that this is like the personal tender bits are highly inflamed, and that's actually what they've been struck with, and maybe even because of something like they've all been struck with dysentery. And so this happens to all the people of Ashdod, and they're like, we want to get this the heck out of Ashdod, so they move it to another city. It hits all the people in that city, and then they're deciding, well, we should move it around because we don't. And the people in the other cities get wind of this, and they're like, oh no, thank you. We don't want that. It's a pretty bad thing. You know, God has gotten heavy-handed himself with the Philistines. They've presumed that they are the conquerors, and they have conquered Israel, and they have conquered Israel's God. And in that arrogance, they bring this God into their midst, and he becomes the conqueror living in their midst. Like I said, he afflicts them with all these terrible things, um, and they just don't know what to do with it. God conquers the idolaters, um, and so what's the takeaway from all? The takeaway is that God's victory over the seemingly and overwhelmingly powerful Philistines is complete. He kills their God. He smites them as he did Egypt. Remember, he hit Egypt with boils and all this other stuff. They even reference that. They're like, yeah, now that we think about it, this is what happened to the Egyptians. Um, and like I said, to add insult to injury, he forced. This is actually what we get in chapter 6, because then they're like, we got to get rid of this thing. What do we do with this ark? And the advice comes back from their prophets and their priests saying, okay, you get 2 milk cows and you take their calves away from them. I don't know if you know this about milk cows, but like they're mama cows and they have calves and they don't like to be apart from their children. And so the idea is basically you tie them to a cart, put the ark on the cart, and you let them loose. And if they go back to Israel on their own, instead of turning around and searching for their chillins, then yeah, God did all this to you. But if they turn around and they're too busy looking for their babies, that you just were terribly unlucky. As it is, no, it was all God. But to add injury to insult on top of all this, to pour salt in the open tumor wound, so to speak, they are told that they have to pay some kind of price for this, and they have to make graven images of the mice and the tumors. Who got to model for the tumors is my question. So these idolatrous people who just had their graven image of their god Dagon killed by the imageless god Yahweh are forced to make graven images of their tumors. Anyway, it's another story they never told you in VBS. See you next week.